Let me tell you everything before you make any judgments. This story isn't about a single event that erupted suddenly. It's about something that quietly grew over the years, something that we tried to suppress, to bury, but eventually it all surfaced. It began that evening when Ethan called me. That simple moment changed everything. Now, weeks have passed, yet the tension of that night still clings to me, refusing to fade. When I left the bedroom that evening, I knew that something complicated was stirring inside me. I couldn't quite put a name to it, but I could feel its weight. I didn't want to project anything outwardly, though. I draped my robe over my shoulders, my hair falling loosely, and stepped into the hallway. It felt like the weight of my life years of exhaustion and responsibility had lightened, even for a moment. As my footsteps echoed softly through the house, I knew that things couldn't stay the same. Something had to change, and it had to happen soon. My thoughts were interrupted when I noticed Ethan standing in front of me. His presence was so striking that it froze me mid-step. Ethan wasn't the boy I once knew. He was a young man now, his frame strong and sure, his shoulders broad, and his eyes those deep, searching eyes seemed to hold years of thoughts and emotions I couldn't yet comprehend. There was something about him, something commanding and yet vulnerable. I could see it in the tension in his jaw, in the way his hands trembled slightly, even as he stood steady. He took a step toward me, and I felt my heart race a knot out of fear. But because the air between us suddenly seemed heavier, more charged, his voice broke the silence, soft yet resolute. "Mom," he said, and the way he said it stopped me in my tracks. "You don't have to keep living like this." I couldn't respond immediately. The words hit me like a wave, and I felt the storm inside me swell. Ethan was so close now that I could feel his breath. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment it felt like the rest of the world faded away. I managed to speak, but my voice trembled. "Ethan, what are you talking about?" He didn't waver. "You've been carrying so much for so long. I see it every day. You're not happy. Why do you keep pretending?" His words were firm but laced with concern. I stepped back slightly, my mind racing. He was right, of course. I couldn't deny it. The cracks in my life had been growing for years, especially in my marriage to Michael. The love and connection we once shared had faded into a routine, a series of motions that we went through because it was what was expected. But hearing Ethan say it out loud, confronting me with the truth I'd been avoiding, was almost too much to bear. "Ethan, stop," I said, my voice shaking. "This isn't something you can fix. It's not your responsibility." "But I see you," he replied. "And I know you feel it too. You don't have to live like this anymore." The intensity of his gaze was too much. I stepped back again, this time retreating toward the bathroom. I needed a moment, a place to collect myself. "That's enough," I said, trying to sound firm, but the quiver in my voice betrayed me. I quickly turned and closed the bathroom door behind me. Inside, I leaned against the cold tiles, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breathing. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on my face, hoping it would snap me out of the whirlwind of emotions that Ethan's words had stirred. For a moment, the shock of the cold water worked, grounding me, but it didn't last. I thought about Michael, my husband, who was away on a business trip, as he so often was. The distance between us wasn't just physical, it had grown emotional too. The love and passion we once shared had eroded over time, replaced by a quiet indifference. We existed together out of habit, not connection. And then there was Ethan. My son, who had grown into a man before my eyes, who seemed to understand me better than anyone else. His words echoed in my mind. You don't have to keep living like this. What did he mean? Did he want me to leave, Michael? Did he think that would solve everything? The questions spun in my head, mixing with the guilt and confusion I already felt. After a while, I turned off the faucet and stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. My hair was damp, my face pale, but my eyes, they betrayed the storm inside me. I took a deep breath and left the bathroom, trying to push the thoughts aside. I walked to the kitchen, hoping the simple act of preparing dinner would give me some sense of normalcy. Ethan was already there, sitting quietly at the table. When he looked up at me, his expression was calm, but his eyes carried the same intensity they had earlier. Dinner will be ready soon, I said, my voice deliberately light. Ethan nodded, but didn't say anything. The silence between us was palpable, filled with everything we weren't saying. As I moved around the kitchen, I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my movements feel unnatural, as though I were being watched too closely. When we finally sat down to eat, the tension was still there. We made small talk, pretending everything was fine, but it was impossible to ignore the undercurrent of unease. Every glance, every word, felt loaded with meaning. That night, after I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Ethan's words in my mind, trying to make sense of everything. The truth was, he had voiced something I'd been too afraid to admit to myself. I wasn't happy. I hadn't been for a long time. But what could I do about it? Could I really walk away from the life I'd built, from Michael, from everything I'd known? The answers didn't come, and as I lay there in the dark, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. The days after that night passed in a blur. I went through the motions of my routine cleaning, working, cooking, but the tension between Ethan and me never eased. His words stayed with me, an echo I couldn't escape, no matter how much I tried to bury them. Michael's absence didn't help. He was still away on his business trip, and though I told myself it was better this way, the house felt emptier than ever. Ethan's presence, on the other hand, was impossible to ignore. He wasn't a boy anymore, and it was clear he saw through the facade I had spent years perfecting. It all came to a head one quiet evening. I was sitting in the living room, folding laundry, when I heard Ethan's footsteps approaching. I didn't look up right away, but I could feel his gaze on me. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. "Mum, we need to talk." I set the laundry aside and looked at him, bracing myself for what I knew was coming. "Ethan, if this is about what you said the other night—" "It is," he interrupted. He stepped closer, his expression unyielding. "I'm not going to pretend everything's fine when it's not. You're not happy, and you know it. Why won't you do something about it?" "Ethan, please," I said, my voice softer now. "This isn't something you need to worry about. It's complicated." "Maybe it's complicated because you make it that way," he shot back. "You're holding on to something that isn't working anymore." His words stung because they were true. I couldn't deny it. The love Michael and I once shared had faded into something unrecognizable. We were strangers living under the same roof, tied together by obligation and habit rather than connection. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to let go. "It's not that simple," I said, shaking my head. "There are things you don't understand." "Then help me understand," Ethan said, his voice rising slightly. "Help me see why you keep putting yourself through this." I couldn't answer him. Instead, I stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the darkened street. The silence between us stretched, heavy and oppressive. After a moment, Ethan moved closer. "Mum," he said, his voice softer now, "I just want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. "I know," I whispered, "but sometimes wanting something doesn't make it possible." Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "You deserve better," he said quietly. Before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening broke the moment. My heart leaped into my throat as Michael's voice echoed through the house. "I think I forgot my wallet," he called out, his tone casual. Ethan and I exchanged a look, and for a split second the tension between us dissolved, replaced by a shared understanding. Without another word, Ethan stepped back, retreating to the hallway as Michael entered the room. "Found it?" Michael said, holding up his wallet with a sheepish grin. He looked at me, then glanced toward the hallway where Ethan had disappeared. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile. "Yes, everything's fine." Michael nodded, seemingly satisfied, and left again, the door clicking shut behind him. When I turned back to the empty hallway, I felt the weight of everything crashing down on me. Ethan's words, Michael's presence, the unspoken truths I had been avoiding, it was all too much. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face, heard his voice urging me to make a change. In the early hours of the morning, I finally gave up and got out of bed. The house was silent, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the windows. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping a cup of tea would calm my nerves. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard me, his expression weary but resolute. "Couldn't sleep either?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head. "I've been thinking about what I said. I didn't mean to make things harder for you." "You didn't," I said quickly. "If anything, you made me face the truth I've been avoiding." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching mine. "So, what are you going to do?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I can't keep pretending. You're right about that." For a while, we sat in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging between us. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, but it was a start. As the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the windows, I felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe things couldn't go back to the way they were, but perhaps that wasn't a bad thing. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go and start over.